What the hell has Joe Biden been doing this whole time? I'm going to bring in my guests. We are joined with the one and the only Patrick Henningsen. He is a journalist and host of SundayWire.com. He was also, by the way, with what is the other publication? In 21st Century Wire is the one that I think I know you from the most. Welcome to the show, man. How you doing this morning? You doing all right?
Yeah, I'm great, Jamal. How you doing?
I am doing fine. I'm doing great, actually. Better that you are joining me. I guess the first thing I want to get into, I asked you, were there any big stories that you were interested in? And you pointed to what I'm calling the apology tour for Blinken and Joe Biden. Now, they're not calling it that. They're calling it the triumphant tour about how great they've done in the world, how strong America is, and how it has benefited its allies. But give me your take on that. Has this really been that successful of a presidency that Joe Biden and Blinken, or for that matter, even Sullivan, is out there crowing about?
It's this is the legacy. It's their legacy tour. Their sort of last flurry to use the resources of the state. Paid for video production, camera crews, producers, PR departments. These sort of Milton Hill type operations in DC. So using the resources for the last couple of weeks to somehow put out the message that these are the great achievements that we've done during the last 4 years. And this is just the level of delusionality, especially on the part of Tony Blinken, is just breathtaking. That he's able to dissociate from the reality to such a degree to look at this disaster in Ukraine, this proxy war against Russia that NATO has waged for the last 3 years. Just put that failure off to the side, and then look at the Middle East, look at Gaza, and how on earth could anyone call this a success? And just sort of smiling and doing all these sort of cheesy photo op type videos to say what a great job you've done and how many air miles you've flown, how many trips you've made. I mean, as if that quantitative analysis has anything to do with the quality of your performance. And it's a disaster. And the disaster is kind of obvious because it's partly baked into the mandate, the loss of the Democrats on November 5th. So, I mean, that's first and foremost. So Biden's a one-term president, a complete failure on every level. You've got a genocide that the United States is basically a co-belligerent, and they're not like a background supporting actor. They're providing all the satellite and targeting information for the
And the
Israelis, all
money,
the bombs,
the
the
bullets,
airplanes,
bombs, everything else.
the
Yeah.
Patriot missile batteries, the whole thing. So the British also are somewhat involved to a much lesser degree, as are the Germans. But the United States is the partner in the war. And Tony Blinken is the point man. His job was to prevent any negotiated settlement, to prevent any ceasefire. And so he was successful, if you want to measure the success of the U.S. Secretary of State, of keeping this slaughter, this industrial scale massacre going. He's been a tremendous success, chalking up one of the worst genocides of the modern era. In fact, one of the easiest slam dunks at the World Courts of Justice for proving a case of genocide. No, it's never been so easy to prove because the evidence is just replete everywhere. And Tony Blinken's been the guy, and he's a partisan actor. He went and introduced himself just a few days after all of this kicked off on October 7th. He arrives in Tel Aviv and says, "I'm Tony Blinken, and as a Jew, I'm here in Israel with Netanyahu, and is not as I'm an American and I'm from the United States." So, but we see a lot of this is America's appointing envoys, appointing ambassadors to countries that somewhat match, the host country. And
Yeah.
in the case of Blinken, he is an Israeli pick. And if you look at Trump's cabinet, just to change the subject slightly, most of Trump's anything to do with foreign policy are completely over the top pro-Israel. And in some cases, like Pete Hegseth, the nominee for defense secretary, he's a religious fanatic. He's a Third Temple dispensationalist, Christian Zionist. I mean, these are really religious fanatics. So, how much input did Netanyahu's government have via Jared Kushner and Howard Lutnick in the picking of all these cabinet people to make sure that the UN ambassador to the United States, like Stefanik, is a rabid Zionist, and to make sure that Pete Hegseth is in there. No qualifications to run the Pentagon, other than he was a weekend Fox News host and maybe has a reservist resume in the U.S. military. It's kind of ridiculous. He did serve at Gitmo, so he was able to lord over all the taxi drivers and goat herders from Afghanistan interned at Guantanamo Bay. But besides that, is he qualified to run the United States the Pentagon? No, of course not. But he is qualified from an Israeli point of view, and that's all that matters. Because if you think about it, who really runs U.S. foreign policy as far as the Middle East goes? It's not Washington. There's nobody in Washington calling those shots. Those shots are absolutely being dictated from Tel Aviv and also from IPAC and the other Israeli lobby organs in Washington in J Street. So, yeah.
Well, I do think they have. God, man, this gets into a fascinating conversation about who is the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail. And you're absolutely right. Anthony Blinken goes to Israel. Goes to the Middle Eastern peace negotiations, says, I am a Jew. And you think to yourself, okay, why are you telling me that? Like, why is that so relevant in a thing that you decided to tell me when you're coming here for these kind of negotiations? And clearly, the only reason you're telling somebody that is because you're giving them some kind of tenor or where your point of view is. This is my framing of this negotiation. I am working at the behest of Israel. And it's so problematic. It's even anti-Semitic in a weird way you look at it, because it's showing this kind of dual allegiance, this foreign allegiance that is typically being put as being this kind of racist or anti-Semitic trope. Okay, they don't seem to believe it's anti-Semitic. I mean, they run with it. Hochstein, the one who Joe Biden had as envoy for Lebanon. So he sends a former IDF soldier to Lebanon to negotiate when IDF soldiers are murdering the Lebanese. It's astonishing. It's just utterly astonishing. But this has been this administration. They have had a clear point of view about we're going to do whatever's in the best of Israel to help it get this greater Israel. I'll give you another case. When not Hochstein, not Blinken, Jack Lew. So there was a recent article that came out with an interview that Jack Lew did with, I believe it was Times of Israel. And in it, he exposes that regardless of what was being said openly, meaning what Joe Biden was saying, oh, Rafah, oh, we care about the Palestinians, oh, this is so horrible, that there was no pressure exerted at all on the Netanyahu government during the course of the election. Meaning they might have said things out openly to the press, but behind the scenes, there was no pressure on Netanyahu. There was no push to restrain action, or for that matter, to inhibit his dropping bombs on tents or freezing kids to death. None of that stuff was happening in real terms. Just astonishing. And then you get this article that comes out yesterday, and I want to get your take on this too, that Donald Trump, Middle East envoy, forced Netanyahu to accept a Gaza deal that he repeatedly rejected. And it goes into this thing of effectively that the envoy goes and strong arms Netanyahu on this. And when I say strong arm, I mean Netanyahu is like, yeah, I'm away for the Sabbath. And the envoy is like, I don't care what you're doing. You're going to get yourself here because we're going to come to some kind of agreement. And effectively put pressure to say, we're closing this chapter. This is going to get resolved. Full stop. Now, this still has to go to, whatever kind of mechanism that they have. I don't know if it goes to the Knesset, but at the very least, it's going to have to go through the defense apparatus that they've created to regard these deals. Give me your take on this, though. I mean, there's the saying that it took Nixon to go to China. Does it take Trump to resolve the issue in Gaza? Because honestly, I don't get the sense that Trump would allow himself to be humiliated in the way that Joe Biden was humiliated. But give me your take on this. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'd like to think that was the case, but it might not even come to that by the time we get to any serious talks. We're just kind of doing, this is the preamble, if you will. But just going
Mhm.
back to the previous comment you made about Amos Hochstein,
Yes.
U.S. Envoy to the Middle East. So with Blinken and Hochstein, it's just stripped away any pretense of any objectivity or any neutrality, any diplomacy.
To
They're there to
transparent.
engineer outcomes on behalf
Yep.
of Israel. Amos Hochstein did the same in Ukraine. He was deeply involved, by the way, in the Biden family corruption schemes with Naftogaz, the reverse gas scheme, all this stuff linked to Burisma Holdings, where Hunter Biden was serving on the board. That's all very well documented. And it's my understanding, based on reports, including reports that we've seen in the Ukrainian media and Ukrainian investigations, that Amos Hochstein has personally profited handsomely, in fact, from his role there. As he's Biden's energy advisor, you have to remember. And
Mhm.
so he's also running foreign policy in the Middle East. He wasn't just the envoy to Lebanon. He was there to basically engineer the entire scope of U.S. Policy, of energy policy, of all the economic leveraging and strong arming of governments there and deal making. And he ended up getting what they want in the end. They toppled
Mhm.
Syria. They gave away the Golan Heights to Israel, and they put a U.S. puppet in as head of the Lebanese government for the time being. So we'll see how that works out in the short term.
Wait one second. I've screwed
Yeah,
something up. One way. Oh, there we are. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I hit something by accident. Please continue. I apologize for that.
sure. And so now we're here to these ceasefire negotiations, and I really don't believe. I mean, that I saw that story that they calling Netanyahu, but he's saying, "Oh no, we're busy. It's Shabbat. We can't turn on any electronic
Right.
devices. We're
Right.
observing the Shabbat." Ridiculous. That I think a lot of this is public relations. It's there to give the image that Trump is coming in with the upper hand, and this
Mhm.
is what the Trump administration require. They don't want to be looking like they're basically toadies to Tel Aviv. So and then what's going to happen is that's a little bit of a concession that Israel has made from a PR point of view, but only temporarily. If you look at the
Mhm.
language in this proposed ceasefire agreement, it kind of gives Israel the right to violate the agreement at any
Yes.
time for any reason. Of course, they will,
Yep.
um, and then they'll blame that on Hamas. 100%. And then Washington will come in and say, this is, Hamas has got to pull up their end of the bargain, and the Israelis are
Mhm.
acting in good faith. And then they'll give Israel license in this agreement to retroactively cancel it and sort of continue their quote war on Hamas. You already see all the reports coming out that admissions that recruitment of Hamas militants and people joining the group, the resistance, has increased. That they've replaced all of their lost ranks already. So I mean,
Mhm.
that's just basically like a red rag to a bull. In terms of like giving the U.S. a justification to give Israel backing to quote finish the job, because that's all the pressure is going to be: finish the job, bring the hostages home. There's only recently we even heard the concept that there might be any Palestinian hostages to swap. It's just been
Okay.
the people looking at it through this one-way lens, not even a binary argument, but like there's only Israeli hostages, and that's ridiculous. There's
Yeah.
up to now
Thousands.
10,000, up to
Yeah.
10,000 languishing in Israeli gulags, a whole chain, all being tortured, starved, raped, all documented, by the way. So, unlike the mass rapes on October 7th that were claimed, that were allegedly done by Hamas, of which there is
It
no
didn't
evidence,
happen.
and
Yeah. There's
even
no evidence for it.
the Israeli media has even basically backed off it. But the only people still running with that old narrative are U.S. politicians, U.S. and Western activists, Zionist activists, and some people in the Western media. They're
Mhm.
running with it. So I mean, there's actual, crimes against humanity being done by Palestinian detainees, as the Israelis call them, in military detention. There's 10,000 of them. That's always been part of the bargain. This is why October 7th was carried out from the Palestinian resistance side, was to get leverage to have all these Palestinian people released. And so that's Israel's leverage, and it's not going to give it up. They may end up giving up some of them, but they're not going to be giving thousands back to the Palestinians. If they do, I'd be very, very surprised, because Israel, again, has the upper hand in the negotiations now. So this, I see this as all theater of what's going on. And there's another thing on the back end of this deal, is that while the U.S. is pretending to look like they have control of the war criminal Netanyahu, to that kind of placates certain audience in the United States, the ones who are protesting, students and so forth, and some parts of the media, and globally, the global South. But what's the quid pro quo on this? It's the West Bank. It's the formal annexing of the West Bank by Israel. Because Israel already has what it wants from the Golan Heights. They've stolen a piece of Syria. They're going to keep it permanently as a security buffer zone. If they're made to withdraw from the Golan Heights, I mean, that would be, to me, a shock. I can't see that happen.
I can't see it happening.
Mount Hermon gives them 360-degree advantage, gives them artillery fire over Damascus, gives them artillery fire over most of South Lebanon as well, maybe even almost as far as Beirut. So, I mean, this is just incredible that what Israel's been able to achieve militarily. And then now they're in a position to take land from South Lebanon again. They're in a position.
Wait, real quick. Let's be clear, though. They didn't do this by themselves. I mean, like, the U.S. has invested like 70%, if not more, of the money that that Israel has been using to either bomb, to either kill, or for that matter, to invade. So it's like, they've had all of the powers of the Western governments backing them and doing this stuff. Like, it's not just like, I get it, right? It is their military, but their military is being fully funded by the United States, who are paying 70 to 80% of what they're expending to do that stuff with, meaning they couldn't do it without us.
Yeah, no, they couldn't do it. They couldn't fly their F-35 missions without the U.S., the British. The drones are providing reconnaissance, surveillance. They're providing the ability to triangulate. They have satellite data that's being fed in real time. It's all U.S. kit, pretty much. And it's U.S. staff operating it. It's U.S. command working together with the IDF. So it was U.S. bombs, U.S. planes, U.S. Patriot missiles, U.S. artillery, U.S. bullets. Everything is U.S. pretty much, except for the soldiers. But even then, there's some assistance there on the special forces level as well. This has also been proven throughout this dirty war against the Palestinians. So, but the main thing is they're co-belligerent. So if they're a co-belligerent, then the U.S. is technically responsible for all the dead, the wounded. Right now, the numbers that we're talking about, the latest Lancet study, I mean, I think it's an underestimation, but they're talking about excess deaths and people who died as a result of the siege and combat and bombing, and those yet to be, dug out from the rubble. We're talking about upwards of 200,000 Palestinians, 200,000. So, I mean, if we continue for the next 6 months, you could be looking at 250,000. So, and I asked this question from the beginning of this conflict, or the beginning of this genocide. I said, what's the upward limit for outreach in the West? What is it? 50,000? It's clearly not that. I thought it was. I thought it was going to be like 30,000. I thought it hits 30,000 and everyone in the world's going to be demanding a screeching halt.
See, that's the rub.
It kept going. And now
the moment it hit,
it's to underreport now. Yeah, it's to underreport. And also, they don't have any administrative capability in Gaza to keep track of the dead. Israel's just systematically destroyed all hospital administration, healthcare facilities, plus killed most of the people doing this job, as well as all the doctors. So, I mean, they've ticked every conceivable box that one could tick for proving a systematic genocide.
But see, that's the rub. The moment that you hit that 30,000 number, people are like, well, we hit 30,000, we can keep going. Like, it's almost like it breaks a barrier. It's like it breaks a ceiling. It's like the higher that number gets, the more accustomed people get to that number.
It's a barrier. It's a barrier of absolute evil, and
Yeah.
and that might sound hyperbolic, but from the Israeli side, it's, the higher the death toll, and of course they've been downplaying it massively, especially in the last
Hmm.
few months. And but the higher the death toll, the more emboldened the Israeli hard, extreme religious fanatic, extreme right faction, and that's running policy right now in Israel.
Hmm.
They get more emboldened, and they get more. They're getting more encouraged. Look at the tantrums being thrown by Itmar Ben Gvir and Bezzy Smallchurch, these fanatics in the Likud cabinet. They were so upset that even the mention of any ceasefire, and they're threatening to basically implode
The
the
government.
Likud coalition. There, they see the finish line. The finish line for them, they feel like the final, what they call the final solution to the Palestinian problem. Sound familiar? What
Yeah.
they think that it's within their grasp now, which is to fully ethnically cleanse the whole of Gaza, push any remaining residents into refugee tents in the Sinai Desert, and then completely take over the Gaza Strip. So ethnically cleanse or kill, whichever comes first,
What stops them?
and by any means necessary.
Yeah, what stops them? I mean, they've demonstrated that they could do it with the world just standing. Like, that's the rub, right? The moment that you've accomplished part of it, you realize, okay, well, nobody's going to intervene.
Mm.
Basically, we've been given a blank check to do this. So, yeah, we're going to annex the West Bank. Nobody's going to stop us.
Yep.
And depending upon the number of people that we get killed, we're going to have the U.S. backing us saying, well, look, it's not that bad. They were terrorists. These kids were carrying bombs. There were, bombs in trash cans. So we had to kill and blow up the entire block. Like there is no pushback to their action from the standpoint of the world. The world may complain, but there's no real pushback. There's nothing that stops them from doing it. The moment that they realized that there was nothing stopping them from doing it, well, the mold had been broken. The chains were off. And so
Yep.
this is what they're doing. They're going to annex the West Bank, and Trump is going to give them a pass in doing so.
And just look at the West Bank. Look at the West Bank. If there's a calamity in the West Bank, and we already saw the beginnings of that in the last 6 months, on a bigger scale. If that becomes a really horrible situation, those residents are going to be pushed. They're going to be pushed into Jordan in the same way that Israel is trying to create refugees, push them into Egypt, into the Sinai Desert. Israel will do the same. That will put tremendous pressure on the Jordanian government. And it's my belief, as well as many others who are looking at this situation closely, that the Jordanian royal family will not survive that
Well, they're
type
not going to accept it. I mean,
that
Jordan and
type
Egypt
of
has
pressure.
already said.
The royal family cannot withstand that level of pressure.
Well,
It will collapse their government, and so that is also a potential knock-on effect to what we're
mhm.
seeing here is regime change in Jordan, as well regime change in Egypt. So this new Middle East, this Greater Israel project, you could see the complete evisceration down the road of the Egyptian military and the Jordanian military. All it would take is just basically the United States just to back off, and then Israel can very easily create a situation where they can, liquidate the Air Force with the help of the U.S., of course, quietly, but liquidate the Air Force and some of the military assets of Egypt and also of Jordan. And then what's to stop them from bombing Amman or bombing Cairo or bombing Damascus at that point? Nothing.
Nothing,
There's nothing
nothing,
stopping them. Nothing.
nothing at
Nobody
all.
can do a thing. And if they do, there's going to be a repeat of the 6-Day War. It might be much longer than 6 days at that point. But Israel's willing to take that chance. They've shown that they're willing to go all the way for their territorial ambitions.
Those Middle Eastern governments have to know that, though. I mean, like the moment that you see them bomb Lebanon, the moment that you see them just completely eviscerate either the West Bank or, for the matter, Gaza, sure, certainly they know that they are also eligible to be bombed like that. If there was nothing to protect Beirut, why does Amman believe it's protected? I guess that's my thing, right?
They thought they were, and to the treachery of these countries conspiring against Bashar al-Assad and the government in Syria, the Arab treachery of going along with the West in this regime change. It took a long time. This Assad was supposed to be ousted in 2013.
Right.
11 years later, finally they finished the job, and look what comes in the vacuum of that is basically an Islamic State with its head in Damascus, full Sharia, Al Qaeda government in Damascus,
With
and they
America's
thought,
backing.
and they're swallowed that. They swallowed that. Now they're looking at the real ramifications of that. Within days, Israel took that basically to not only annex territory, but liquidate the entire Syrian military within 4 days.
Yep.
With no resistance, no air defense, nothing. Their navy's gone. That could very easily happen to other Arab countries in the region. And then the United States will sit back and say, that's just Israel's got a right to defend itself.
Yep.
Israel's got a right to defend itself. All they have to do is say that there's ISIS activity in the Sinai, and then the United States will move in. We'll have bases in the Sinai, like we did before. We've had joint force bases in the Sinai. We'll just expand that. Israel will then have operational access to that, and very quickly, if Israel chooses, it can extend its security perimeter into Egypt. No problem. And South Lebanon. No problem. And the map changes at that point. That's what this is what must be the deal that Trump has promised Israel.
Mm-hmm.
They can have all these things, but they have to do this performative, dance in public with these ceasefire negotiations to appear to be honest brokers. But in reality, Israel has a laundry list of things it wants to achieve very, very quickly in the next year or two. And I think so you're going to see maybe some impasse. They'll allow Hamas time to regroup and to create, the next kind of ranks of resistance, and then they'll turn on the heat again, and then they'll extend. The ISIS will be able to be mobile and on the move. The U.S. and its allies in Israel can direct ISIS to appear, or Al Qaeda to appear wherever they want, and then use that as a pretext.
Just to back you up on this is Blinken saying that Hamas has effectively reformed itself. And then, you think to yourself, okay, then what was all of this for? You've killed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and now you're just telling me that Hamas has effectively come back.
Avoid. Indeed, we assess that Hamas has recruited almost as many new militants as it has lost. That is a recipe for an enduring insurgency and perpetual war. The longer the war goes on, the worse the humanitarian situation gets in Gaza.
So what the hell was this for?
He's just teed it up right there.
Yeah.
He's put the tee in the green. He's put a nice Dunlop brand new range ball on it, and he's handing the driver to Donald Trump and saying, "Go on, you ready? There you go, mate."
It's like Hamas is back. You got to get back in there. You got to, Israel has the right to defend itself.
Absolutely. That's how I'm reading this, and I'm extremely cynical. Obviously, I always put my money on being skeptical of whatever noises are coming out of Washington. I always bet against it. Always bet against the market. The mainstream market of information. I always bet against it.
Well,
I'm rarely wrong. I'm right probably 85 to 90% of the time.
Well, you're not wrong for thinking that. If you think back to Joe Biden, for example, Joe Biden initially was like, well, they're not going to go into Rafah. We're not going to allow them to go into Rafah. If they go into Rafah, there are tanks in Rafah. And what does Joe Biden say? Well, they're not really in Rafah. It's like, dude, there are tanks literally riding through. Well, the Philadelphia corridor is a red line. Okay, they take that. Meaning everything that Joe Biden said, he allowed. That's the part that blew me away more than anything else. Typically, presidents don't like to be humiliated. They don't like to put themselves in a position where they look weak or they look out of it. Joe Biden had allowed himself over and over and over again to just look horrendous. And then it became very clear, okay, well, there's no restraint on this. The kooks are leading the House in this case. You've put people with seemingly allegiance to Israel over the U.S. government in positions of authority in order to dictate policy.
Yeah.
And like you pointed out, their policy was very transparent, regardless of what they said. It was very transparent. Um,
One last thing. To hold that
please,
thought. Last thing. Tony Blinken is not finished. Even though he'll be the outgoing Secretary of State, he's in transition until the Senate confirm the next one.
yeah,
How long will that take? Nobody knows. Could be weeks, could be into February. Okay, so he's going to remain, and there will be a role for him most likely. Where does someone like that go after basically setting the region alight and
kind of
delivering all of this for Israel? He may very well end up getting some kind of other envoy role, some sort of peace envoy role, something possibly to like Tony Blair did after his premiership in Britain. He ended up basically getting the whole floor of a hotel in Jerusalem to set up Tony Blair and Associates and basically rake in millions of dollars. That was Tony Blair's payoff for delivering the Iraq War for Israel. So Tony Blair delivered the Iraq War for the U.S. and Israel. Without Tony Blair, it wouldn't have happened. The whole thing wouldn't have happened. So he was rewarded afterwards. Tony Blinken will be rewarded for his dirty work. Make no mistake about that. And it's not necessarily going to be confined to being on the board of the KBR or one of these other military industrial defense contractors. He'll be on the board of those for sure. But he's proven that he can deliver. That he will run cover for a genocide for 15 or 16 months. If you're the mafia, that's your consigliere. He will deliver. There's no question about it. And he's slimy enough to slide through the greasy wheels of Washington and everywhere else. Tony Blinken will be assigned something. It's just a question of when and how that's going to take shape. But I don't see him finishing. He's done such a good job. I can't see him.
He's been a sociopath, right? Like I've never seen anything like it. Somebody who would get out there dead-eyed, look you in the face and say, Israel has the right to defend itself. That soldier that murdered that baby. I mean, that baby was dangerous. Like he has I've never seen anything like it. Him, Matt Miller, Patel, this group of people, even against his own president, by the way. I mean, because if you think about it, you can make an argument that part of the reason Joe Biden lost the presidential election and was obviously, meaning Kamala Harris lost, was because of their policy on Gaza. I mean, keep in mind, you had a large contingent of people who were Democrats, kids who were out there protesting that war. Sure. And when you have the situation where Harris, Joe Biden are so wed to this kind of greater Israel project, then it was obvious that this was going to cause a backlash in regards to the election.
It was absolutely on the ballot. It played a factor. It did in Michigan, and it just in general it created a tremor within the Democratic Party and the DNC establishment. So much so that also contributed to them having to switch horses in the middle of the race. Because it was a disaster they couldn't avoid. Imagine children, kids, newly registered Democrat voters calling the sitting president Genocide Joe.
I know.
I mean, it was a total disaster for the Democrats.
But they didn't care. They still ran with it. That's the wild part, right? Like over the course of the election, I kept saying, how is Joe Biden and Kamala Harris running this race knowing full well this is damaging them for Israel, which is mind-blowing when you think about it. You're losing this race for Israel to commit a genocide?
Yeah.
That's astonishing to me.
Yeah.
But they did. I want to get your take on something else before we close. So Joe Biden has gotten out there and said this, and he's talking about the amount of money that the United States has spent. Now, I want you to put this in the context of Mark Rutte recently coming out saying Russia is beating us 3-1 in the amount of arms that it's producing. 3-1. So NATO is being outmatched, meaning all of NATO, with the US included, in regards to the amount of arms that it's producing. 3-1. Joe Biden, despite that, comes out and says this. Come on, Joe. There we are. If I can.
Investing almost $1.3 trillion for Cuban research and development. In real dollars, that's more than America did in any 4-year period during the Cold War.
We have put in $1.3 trillion more than what we've put in any 4 years of the Cold War, and yet Ukraine just got his ass kicked. Like, how do they justify that? Some people are saying that this is effectively the end of NATO, because the one major challenge that NATO failed at, which was effectively to get Ukraine to be a part of NATO. Give me your take on that. I mean, there's a good question of, okay, well, where did all of that money go for another losing war?
Well, the main reason, the main economic reason, is when you're talking about dollar amounts like that, when you're throwing those figures around, especially if you're doing a comparative analysis between epochs like during the Cold War period, 60s, 70s, 80s, beginning of the 90s, and then now, you're talking about also relative purchasing power and
Right.
purchasing parity, and Russia gets more bang for its buck. You look at on paper, the Russian defense budget's around 100 billion.
Mhm.
100 billion. And think of the size of the Russian landmass. Think of their nuclear arsenal. Think of the size of their air force as formidable. And then what they've had to build in order to fight this war against NATO in Ukraine. 100 billion. So they probably get, in real terms, if you put a dollar amount on that, if that was Russia and Moscow was in Washington, D.C., and they're fighting this war there, but with dollars, their military budget would probably be something like 650 billion.
Mhm.
That's what they would be getting in terms of what it's worth.
Bang for
But
the buck.
but you don't, the dollar doesn't go that far. The dollar doesn't go that far. What does the US get for $1 trillion? $1 trillion a year. That's the real 1.2 trillion. That's the real tally for the United States, including overruns and whatnot. When Donald Trump does his first defense budget, it's going to be higher than Joe Biden's last defense budget. It'll be higher, probably 5 to 10% more. And so this is going to be a big thing that Trump is going to be running on. Is I'm going to rebuild the military again. He already rebuilt it, 5 years ago. So he's going to rebuild it again. So he's going to rebuild the military. And then what are you going to get for that? So the U.S. is basically trying to pivot by using proxy wars and by executing offshore balancing, which is their geostrategic strategy. Their imperative for like pulling major U.S. assets back at home and then using their local partners to do the sort of heavy lifting and the enforcement, if you will, in the various regions. And the U.S. is there to provide support. So Israel's kind of playing that role of the U.S. extension, the U.S. proxy in the Middle East, of basically keeping the Anglo-American control of the region without them having to invest blood and treasure too much. They're going to invest a lot of treasure, but not a lot of blood. No boots on the ground. And they did the same with Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, under Obama in 2015, and so many other different examples. Syria is another huge proxy war, and so forth. And NATO actions are as well. Ukraine is a proxy war. That's an offshore balancing move by the United States, but it's not saving them any money. So all it's doing is saving them the political capital that would be expended from losing 50,000 U.S. soldiers. Because show me any U.S. administration after Vietnam that could stomach more than 5,000 during any one presidential term. There's nothing. Look at the blowback they got from Afghanistan and Iraq, with almost minimal, if any, military casualties. I mean, nothing compared to Vietnam, and certainly nothing compared to what Ukraine is being made to endure. Losing 400,000
Hundreds of thousands.
young, and basically wiping out the next generation of Ukrainian men.
Yeah.
The U.S. has successfully achieved that in Ukraine, and they think it's, in the words of Lindsey Graham, this is a great bargain, because we haven't lost any U.S. boys, but we've managed to profit on the defense military industrial complex S&P 500 or whatever. The
Which
stock.
is wild to me, though, because that's not really like there's a difference between a weapons manufacturer getting money versus the American public getting money, right? The U.S. has effectively taken hundreds of billions of dollars. I'm sorry. Yeah, hundreds of billions of dollars and dumped it into the weapons manufacturing industry. And same thing with Europe. They've gotten Europe to be able to do the same thing. So they've gotten all of these European countries to A, increase the amount of money that they were spending on their defense industry, and B, take that money and dump it into the U.S.
Yeah.
Like, that's astonishing to me.
Well, that gets back to your original point, Jamal, is the Russia's still out producing
Right.
NATO. So basically NATO as a concept, it doesn't work. You can't have ready interoperable forces. Just doesn't work. It's never been tested, and they don't want to test it. Nobody in NATO wants to go into combat with Russia. Nobody. This is why they've poured everything into Ukraine. In a way, European countries are scared of having to go into a real war, and so they've done everything to encourage and bribe and arm and support and give political cover to Zelensky in Ukraine in order to avoid having to actually go into combat, because that's their biggest fear. So if NATO is so great and they're spending all this money, certainly they have no problem fighting the Russians. They have this huge, they say, well, we've got France as a nuclear power, Britain's a nuclear power, but they don't matter. The United States is the only force in NATO that matters. Everybody else is really a minor operator who's along for the ride, who might contribute a few things, but none of them have any serious standing forces. And young people don't want to get in a war with Russia. There's nobody clamoring, and nobody in Europe, other than politicians and think tanks and a few hawks in the media, nobody is interested in fighting Russia or going to war on behalf of NATO. A vanity war, World War III on behalf of the United States and NATO. Nobody's interested. Only hawkish politicians, and those hawks are more and more situated further away from the battle, from the front line. So that's the United States, maybe one or two, maybe in Norway. A few hawks in Sweden, but they'll becoming less hawkish the more the escalation with Russia becomes, because now Sweden and Finland are on the front line. They weren't before. They were neutral. Now they're on the front line as NATO members. Ditto with a number of Central European countries. So I mean, the United States is, hawkish, and U.S. is with Trump is going to say, okay, let's wind this down, because that seems to be a popular thing to do, because they can't fight a two-front war. If you have to give up one, it's going to be Ukraine, because Israel, that's a non-negotiable. But they're not going to be able to get the deal in Ukraine that they have been talking like they can get, because nobody wants to admit the fact that the U.S. holds no cards in Ukraine at all, and that it's Ukraine, Kiev, Zelensky, it's a busted flush.
How do you think that ends, by the way? I mean, because you're right, Russia's not going to freeze the conflict. And from their point of view, you have many people who are saying they need to go to the border. I don't necessarily think they want to do that. I mean, I don't think they want to own West Ukraine and have to deal with a guerrilla war. But for all intents and purposes, if you stop, you allow another rebuilding on the border, once again, where they're putting all of this military and everything else. What they want is a neutral Ukraine. Do you think they're going to be able to get that?
You're talking about the Polish border, right?
Yeah, Polish border.
The Polish border. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a slow, painful death of Ukraine. I think this is what's being set up, and I don't think I think Trump could theoretically get a ceasefire. He could, but then you're into a similar situation as with Gaza and Israel, with the Palestinian resistance in Israel, is that the U.S. is backing Kiev, just like the U.S. is backing Netanyahu. They're not a neutral party in that. They have an interest in seeing the conflict continue. The same in Ukraine. So they could easily just kind of like give a wink and a nod to Zelensky to violate ceasefire agreements.
Which is why I don't think they can get ceasefire.
We don't have control over this. They're just going a little bit rogue, and they have a right to, because they've been, victimized by Putin so badly. We need to be sensitive to the needs of Ukraine, and this can kind of just drag on, because NATO needs this thing to drag on.
And see, that's why I don't think the Russians are going to accept that. You can look at Syria. and how Syria was this kind of frozen conflict that I think Bashar al-Assad at some point believed might have been over or might have been manageable. And at the moment, at like a moment's notice, it kicks off once again when they have an ability to get an advantage. I don't believe for a moment after the Minsk agreements, after the Istanbul agreements, after the JCPOA, meaning all of these agreements fundamentally just get tossed aside, that, oh, hell, even Astana agreements in the standpoint of Syria, that the Russians see this and will still come to some kind of agreement on a ceasefire by freezing the conflict. I don't get the sense that they're going to do that.
They could temporarily freeze. They could do, but in terms of any long-term lasting negotiated settlement, that can't happen until there's elections in Ukraine, new elections. So there's no incentive for Zelensky to hold those elections. So, but there's incentive to do a whole bunch of things to delay those elections, i.e., keep sort of instability and hostilities going. And then we're into late 20. So right now, in terms of Ukrainian elections, earliest possible date right now would be September 2025. Earliest possible date. More likely,
they were talking about June. Why do you think they're going to push so far up?
I don't see it happening in June. It's just too quick. The only way it would happen in June is if there's a coup. And that if there's a coup in Kiev, it will have to be backed by the United States. So they'll make a coup and they'll put in the person they want, which will either be Valery Zaluzhny, who is the Ukrainian former head of the armed forces, head of the he's a Ukrainian ambassador in London right now, or Alexei Arestovich, who's in the United States. So if who has the final call on that? Britain does. Britain has the final call on that. Of who that's going to be. I think Britain has the final call. Within the NATO rubric, it's more in, you know, because Britain provides the security detail for Zelensky. They have so much control over the center of power in Kiev. Plus, British intelligence is right up in there as well. So and it would have to be somebody accepted by the Ukrainian military. Overwhelmingly, that's Valery Zaluzhny. But I think a better candidate for the U.S. would be Arestovich, because Arestovich wants to see a neutral Ukraine, not a member of NATO, and is willing to deal with the West and Moscow simultaneously. So that's better for Washington. Britain is much more extreme. They're much more extreme and much more strident against Russia. And so they don't want to be seen to lose to Russia. America could very easily wash its hands of this, you know, pull back, militarize the whole of Poland and Scandinavia and call it a win, basically.
Well, Trump would say this is Joe Biden's war, meaning that's Trump's out. This is not my war. This is Joe Biden's war. This is Joe Biden's project.
Yeah, he's got that advantage. He can just pawn off the failures on Biden and build on some new successes. But so all that stuff we're talking about here, Jamal, it's just not. I can't see that happening by June, unless there's a coup, and that'll have to be an engineered coup, and it'll have to be Western engineered, and then we could see snap elections in the summer, and then we can see the Russians coming for a real negotiation at that point.
One last question before I let you go: how does NATO leave a loss like this intact? Because I've had plenty of people who come on the show who was like, this is the end of NATO. Like, you can't have a military organization that you've built up over the course of 30, 50 years, and then it gets into a major conflict and loses. Like the first major conflict against the thing that it was set up to fight. In fact, it was set up to fight the Soviet Union, a much bigger entity than what Russia is today. And so if it couldn't handle Russia, which is a much smaller entity than the Soviet Union, it would have gotten crushed by the Soviet Union if you think about the military size of the Soviet Union. Like, how does NATO limp out of this intact, or does it?
I think it's the end. It'll be the end of NATO personally in the long run, but in the short run, I think they'll double down and they'll basically they'll keep a hawkish chorus within the NATO conversation in Europe, and Britain leading that hawkish chorus, and of course the United States weighing in as hawks, but then simultaneously trying to, you know, be stabilizers. But the United States still needs NATO. It can't Donald Trump's talking a little bit of pre-negotiations by threatening to pull out of NATO, putting out leaks here and there. All he's doing basically is putting pressure on the art of the deal to get European countries to pay more money, like 5% of their GDP on defense. And all that's going to do is bankrupt Europe. It's going to push a lot of these countries into deficit spending. They'll have to cut social programs and essential programs and infrastructure. It'll make Europe poor and make them more in debt to the central banks and to the United States. And so it's all part of the policy. What I think is the U.S. policy to weaken Europe economically. And so the British and the Americans are taking Europe down, as they did with Nord Stream, as they did with sanctions against Russia, taking the European economy down. And when economic influence reduces, so does political influence. And so does geopolitical influence. And then basically at that point, Brussels is neutered. And if they're not already, but right now they're just a partner of U.S. interests. Ursula von der Leyen is a U.S. agent working effectively on behalf of Washington at the moment. But they can go down even a step further economically and politically. And if NATO just becomes at that point just a the protection racket for Europe, and then it will eventually die. But that's
what it is. I mean, look, that's what Trump considers it, right? It's like, hey, that's a nice business you got there. Maybe you need some, protection for that business. Yeah. Like the moment they just like, I need you to put it in 2%. And then he goes and says, now I need you to put 5%.
It's Tony Soprano. Hey, you don't buy your oil from the Russians over there. You're gonna buy your gas from us, and we've got the markup. Well, don't worry, we'll take care of the Russians for you. Just spend the money you don't have the money, we'll lend you the money. We'll lend you the money. And you can buy it with our money and then pay us back with our money.
It's so outrageous.
It's exactly like that. It's the mafia.
That's what it feels like. That's what it comes across as. Patrick, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate this conversation. Patrick Henningsen, he's geopolitical analyst, journalist, and host of SundayWire.com. You can also find his reporting on 21st Century Wire. Man, much appreciated, man. Thank you for this.
Take care, Jamal.
You too. Have a good one.